And now for something completely different. We will transition over to the last panel on unsupported devices. So I'm very glad to have the folks with me up here on the panel. I'll let them just give a couple of sentence introduction for themselves. So,
Ilias Ganzos, I'm Broadcom's Chief Privacy Officer. Broadcom, a company that is combining infrastructure software with semiconductors.
I'm Chris Gow. I'm head of Brussels office for Cisco, also Senior Director for EU Public Policy.
Christian Schatz, I am Security Director at British Telecoms.
Great. So the last panel was talking about stuff in the future. We're going to talk about stuff from the past. So we're going to talk about unsupported technology. But that does not necessarily mean that all old technology is bad. So let's actually first talk about the distinction between unsupported technology and old technology, and what actually is the distinction there.
Okay, I'll go first. Have you seen, how many of you have seen a movie like Terminator Genesis? Okay.
I love bad action movies.
You know, Schwarzenegger bumping his head on the table and going old but not obsolete. That's really what we're talking about. So the way I think about the distinction between old technology and let's say, unsupported technology is really about making a technological choice that is based on, let's say, an older design, an older solution, an older technological approach, but one which is still continues to be supported, basically. One that continues to be updated, one that continues to be running and being capable of addressing current and existing threats in the current threat environment.
And just on the VT side, I mean, it's a 175 years old company, and sometimes walking through some of the darker places, you feel like you find equipment that is 175 years old. Yeah. Probably not, but I mean, you always discover stuff. I think the distinction there is really, at most companies, they acquire from a supplier for a high cost material at some point in time. And the more specialized it is, the more reluctant the company is to get rid of this or replace it with new stuff, because it's not very convenient. It is costly again, costs time. So companies are sweating the equipment, as we call it. Mm-hmm. And this goes often way beyond the official supported life cycle that was indicated initially for the thing. And I've been working in content protection and anti-piracy for quite a few years. We had set-top boxes and TVs and stuff like this. And officially, well, you got 5 years of timeline for those devices, but you and I know that you don't replace your TV every 5 years, do you? So there you go.
No. Just very quickly, a thought that crosses my mind in the enterprise space. I mean, the dinosaur of cloud computing was actually mainframe. How many of you have actually seen a mainframe? Excellent. So yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well, we're selling mainframe software. I mean, still, you can't find a programmer who's older than 50, who's younger than 50, you know, on mainframe. It's actually really difficult to find people who will tell you, yeah, I want to learn. We have a difficulty attracting programmers in the mainframe space, because it's an older technology, but that doesn't mean it's unsupported. In fact, possibly your credit card transactions are running on things like mainframe, exactly because it's so prevalent in the finance space and considered actually very secure.
So I think, you know, so the key is that we're not necessarily, you often hear the term legacy technology. And while there may be reasons and security reasons to actually move on from legacy technology, I think the real point is we're actually talking about unsupported technology. And that's where the real security problems start to emerge. So maybe Chris, if you wanted to start with sort of what are the things that make unsupported tech? I mean, it's, this crowd probably knows, but let's set the baseline. What makes unsupported technology so problematic from a security standpoint?
I think the first thing to think about is, before we talk about exactly what makes it bad, is how much unsupported stuff is there out there, right? So if you don't mind, I know it's late in the day, so I want to play a game. So everyone put their hands up. You have to start. Every single person. Everyone put your hands up. I'll put mine up as well. Now, the game is this. I want you to guess, if you look at global organizations, global, so big companies, big public sector around the world, how much of the devices that they have connected to their networks are unsupported? And if you hear your number, you think that's the number, you put your hand down because you've reached it, okay? So I'm going to start at 5%. Does everyone think that there's at least 5% of devices out there which are unsupported? Okay, everyone believes that, except for Bree, who, is playing on her phone over there. 10%. Anyone putting their hand down at 10? No, everyone thinks there's at least 10% which is out there. Okay, let's up the ante. 20%. 1 in 5 devices. Okay, I see some hands going down. Okay, that sounds pretty reasonable, right? But I'm going to keep going up. 30%. Yeah, okay, good choice, Ines, over there. 40%. All right, okay, I think we see where the majority lies. 50%. Okay, two hands still up at 50%. I'm not going. Mine's fake. This is not a real hand here. I'm just playing along. Yeah. 48%. 48% either obsolete or aging. Now, you can get worse, right? If you go and look at it in the medical sector, that number jumps up to 71%. If you go in public sector, the number is 62%. So I think even before we think about, what's the problem, let's look at how wide an issue this actually is today. On what the problem is, that number, by the way, was borrowed from a study by NTT in 2020. Now, in the same study, they said that the amount of vulnerabilities you would find on an unsupported device versus a current one was more than twice as much, right? So think about that. Just the amount of vulnerabilities which are available there. By the way, it was also a problem with aging technology. Now, I want to play this along. So for aging, it was close to 1.5 times as many as something which was the latest version, right? So think about vendors essentially, they'll still support it, but maybe their most focus is going to be on the latest version that they have going out. So one, I think you see that the devices are more vulnerable themselves, right? There's more vulnerabilities, more weak points to hit. The second issue is that, the impact when they are hit is greater, right? So think about it from this point. If you have the typical NIST framework way of looking at it, the time to detect is likely going to be longer. The ability to react and then to recover to that is also going to be longer, because the device itself, the technology, is moving further and further away from the security architecture of the company and the other things which are moving on with the technology around it. So I think, that would be my answer.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts on?
Yeah, I've got two thoughts to add to this. The first one is you need to know about vulnerabilities. Much of the equipment that is unsupported doesn't get inspected for vulnerabilities. So people are actually not publishing anything about this. And even if you get this, companies are very reluctant to provide patches for those vulnerabilities, fixes for those vulnerabilities when they're out of support. There was some recent examples like Log4j 2 years ago. Many of us suffered through that. In this case, companies provided back patches or back ports of patches to unsupported software as well, because it was deemed so critical that it needed to be fixed. But otherwise, you don't get those patches at all. And you're getting essentially forced to upgrade your devices or your software stack overall. And this is very costly and very impactful.
On the other hand, what you just said, you're getting forced to upgrade. I can see why on the fact that you've reached the end of life, the end of life of the software from the point of view of the risk that software carries is a big question mark, right? But yeah, it's true. You are in a situation whereby you're forced to take an action, and you're forced to take action, I would even say, in a state of being rushed. So perhaps it's not the best action, but the circumstances drive it there. Because again, in an operational environment, unless the technology is cloud-based, you, meaning the operator of the technology, carry the responsibility of patching, upgrading, and securing. So is there a patch? Have you deployed the patch? If you deploy the patch, how does it interact with your other tools? And what additional protections can you put in place if there is no patch? These would be I don't know, Christian, if you agree, but that would be the operational challenges that you would face.
Yeah, and I think this actually leads to kind of the question that I wanted to kind of explore, which is that, you know, one of the things that you quickly realize in cybersecurity, right, is that there are some of the problems are technical, but a lot of the problems that drive things are actually not technology incentives, but they're economic incentives. And so, you know, when I worked the OPM intrusion issue when we were in the government, what you find with the Office of Personnel Management is that it was running, you know, sort of 2000s apps on top of 1990s operating systems on top of 1980s hardware. But why is that? Well, you mentioned government. Well, in the US government, it is relatively easy to get marginal cost operating dollars in the budget process. It is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for many agencies to get procurement money to buy new stuff. Mm-hmm. The entire budgeting process is designed to ensure that federal US government agencies keep old technology around as long as they possibly can. Mm-hmm. So that's an example of, it's not that the people running those agencies are stupid and don't realize that they shouldn't be upgrading the technology, it's that the incentive structure is stacked against them. So what are some of the other factors out in the private sector that actually drive companies to keep, you know, or other organizations to keep this kind of unsupported technology around? And you were talking about some of them, but let's expand on some of this.
Yeah, I mean, so I think cost is a big one, right? Unless, you know, whether it's to do with the cost incentives that you're talking about or just generally, right? I mean, and I think you actually hit on something in terms of the cost. The cost isn't necessarily just the cost of replacing a device. You know, there's an intrinsic relationship between the hardware, your operating system, and the application software on top. So it might not just be about replacing one thing. It can be all three. You know, even the hardware can be embedded in other hardware, right? So there's an issue with the cost itself of the device. The second I would say is about the cost of migration, and what I really mean by that is the disruption. So both, you know, spreading out the actual rollout, right, the actual resources, the time to push it out, and also, frankly, what breaks. Right? I mean, you know, this is why normally when things are rolled out, they're not rolled out 100% all at the same time, right? There's probably going to be some in-house application which is going to stop working, right? And you're going to have to work
which
through.
Has been running since 2002 and nobody has paid any attention to.
Which actually, you know, is what I would come on to is saying, look, this problem gets worse though. The longer that you don't replace, the worse these problems become. And the third one I would say within this is also about the staff, right? I mean, staff are reluctant. They don't want to move to a new process, a new piece of software, learn a new way of doing things, whether it's better or not. Right? We've all built that way. You like using what you're used to using. So there's an implication there when it comes to that. But if you think about the reverse, why this gets worse, well, the cost obviously goes up over time in terms of what you need to replace, what other things they're reliant on. The cost of migration certainly goes up over time because, you know, frankly, there may be bits of software which are you're running, which no one even knows how they work anymore and what they're interconnected with and how that plays out. And third, the impact on staff goes up. And what I mean is you get new staff coming in who are maybe having to use this legacy piece of software that no one understands anymore, doesn't have any of the features, you know, downtime in terms of productivity, and probably doesn't run very well, right? You know, by this point in time. So I think you can see the things which hold up the migration are also the things which become more of a problem over time. Go.
I'll be quick. So they're not broken, so why change it? Mm-hmm. Is a very sort of like known problem across the industry. And I would even go as far as to say, even in the patching scenario, that don't touch it, you know, because the city gets its electricity from it, and we don't want anything to go wrong with that. That's a sort of like a very real thing. But from my perspective also, one of the things that has made really an impression to me from personal experience has been the complexity of organizations. So how organizations grow, if you think about it, acquisitions, for example, if you think mergers, if you think just government agencies getting additional responsibilities, all this sort of stuff that where the institutional memory goes, where you inherit an architecture, a technological architecture that is there, and then the challenge that you face is you need to integrate it, and you don't necessarily have the means or the capability, or you have to prioritize it, and you just deprioritize the thing you understand the least. And let's not forget also the reality that often large organizations, and certainly in the public sector, tend to be uncoordinated. We bought piece of equipment A, we bought piece of equipment B. They need C for them to work. One side migrated, the other didn't, but they still need C to interoperate. And the time goes by and, the C component is still there. Personally also, other than the undocumented, I'll also say sometimes even organizations, the undocumented tool, meaning it was built, we did some edits to it, and now it works by black magic because, we fired the engineer who did it, or he retired 15 years ago. But also I've seen that very much in homemade solutions. I take a sort of like a market-driven technology, then I build on top of that stuff, and they're run on its own. And then after a while, again, the people who've built it are gone, but that still keeps running, and I don't dare to touch it. So the complexity of the organizations amplifies that problem when we're dealing with large groups.
I think the incentives are wrong. Let me explain. So in any organization, you've got a three-legged stool model, if you can visualize this. So one of them is delivery. So you're building new exciting stuff, quantum, yeah, sexy. This is what we want to see. The other part is you need to run this equipment, you need to operate it, you provide a service. So service availability is absolutely key today. And the third part is security. So you want to make sure that this is also secure, which contributes obviously to the service availability. But today the incentives are very clear that as an engineer, I want to get the latest equipment, I want to have fun, and you want to build this out because this is exciting me. Huh? I'm building new stuff. Replacing old stuff with the same value is not very motivating for me. So the incentives are wrong there. And the second part is often companies very simply prioritize service uptime because this is how they make money over security. And it's very clear. It's cost, but it's actually availability in this case. So if your service goes down, you can talk about security as much as you want. If your service is down, this will get prioritized. And this also means in the flip side that it's very easy to find a senior manager that signs off on a risk in a corner because it's a risk. It's not a reality. It's not an issue right now, an incident, to accept the security risk and instead keep your equipment and continue sweating it.
Yeah, so I think this actually leads well into kind of the next sort of area that I wanted to look at. I will throw out one more sort of issue, that is why unsupported technology creates some of the problems, which is that it actually also puts an anchor on new technology because we often force new technology to be backwards compatible, so that it retains some interoperability with the old technology, which maintains some of the vulnerabilities are just brought forward into the new stuff. But Christian, you're getting at the point, which is that, we know that it's much easier to calculate the cost of upgrading the technology, right, than it is to, including the potential for downtime and other things, than to calculate the cost of not upgrading the technology because it's actually a potential risk. I think what are some of the policy changes that could, alter that incentive structure? How can we start thinking, since this is a policy conference, we can start thinking about what are the policies that can start to change some of these incentives that we've been talking about?
Very simply, cybersecurity needs to be more valued. We're at a policy setting conference, policy discussing conference around cybersecurity. So obviously we all understand the value of it. In the UK, we've got the Telecom Security Act. We've touched on this a couple of times today. It's a key legislation that hits, to put it bluntly, all of the telecoms sector, especially tier one operators such as us. We need to really raise the cybersecurity bar. But the combination of this regulation, the 10% of global revenue impact if you fail to raise the security bar, plus all of the customers that call up us and talk about data breaches or something like this is really motivating us a lot. And so when I go to speak to end customers, both individuals such as myself and my mom and others, and then businesses as well, they look at BT for two things. The first one is we connect for good. This is actually our purpose. And the other one is they consider BT being a trusted company and a trustworthy company. And you know that trust is earned over a long time and easily lost. So the value of cybersecurity contributes very heavily in there. So to answer your question, Michael, I think from a policy point of view, the first step has been done for the telco industry. GDPR has been helping as well because it came to people's minds that there is value to the data they're giving, that if you're using Facebook, Instagram, and all of the others, and if you're not paying for it, you're the product. So keep this in mind. And you're getting more conscious, despite all giving away your private email addresses, your name, stuff like this. Keep in mind, you're the product for it. So the value of this goes up. And from a policy setting point of view, I think we have addressed, at least in the UK, quite a bit of this. The CRA will help us as well in the EU, I think. And we've got a similar thing that is called the Product Security and Telecom Infrastructure Act in the UK, which requires devices from the 29th of April to have a very clear supported end date. We are talking about supported and unsupported devices, and also a responsible disclosure policy that needs to be available and unique credentials. And I think this is a small bar, but it's an important bar to raise.
So I would add a couple of things. I think there's carrots that you can use and there's sticks, right? To use the old adage. So I think on the carrot side, you can use tax incentives on, on write-downs, on, making sure that you move to new technology, right? So you can think about it from a technology refresh point of view. I think you can also encourage it through cyber insurance and how you motivate that on the cyber insurance side. I think on the stick, and we're in the EU, so we like our sticks. Frankly, I would disagree with you. I don't think CRA does help. So for me, I think this falls in a blind spot between CRA and NIS. So on NIS2, you have this requirement that critical infrastructure operators, called important essential entities, but it's critical infrastructure, go out there and have organizational measures in place, right, to look after security. On CRA, what you have is you tell vendors or products on the product security side that they have to be transparent and have supported time for their devices. But there's a gap there which doesn't really say, oh yeah, critical infrastructure guys, you have to stop using those devices when they are no longer supported. So for me, I think the policy answer on this is to turn around and say, well, at least for critical infrastructure, potentially as a starting point, you have to remove by default, right? So I don't want to say that there aren't mitigating circumstances, and I'm sure we'll go into some of those, where you can't remove an unsupported device, and there's very good reasons for not doing so. But at least it should be, that's the presumption, that once it reaches end of life, that should be removed from your network and information systems.
I think they're good arguments from both sides, and I'm saying that because when I'm looking at the discussion between NIS and CRA, yeah, there's a gap there. At the same time, for instance, when the way I'm seeing DORA developed, DORA is the first regulatory instrument of the EU that, to my knowledge, talks about legacy devices, okay, and requires the financial institutions to do the risk assessment of the legacy devices and address that. So in many ways, we actually see that sipping in, if you like, into the regulatory process. And it's going to be interesting given the dominant role of the financial institutions in all economies and in the European economy, how they will drive this discussion around the use of those technologies. So between on one hand that and the reality that depending on how you want to interpret this, again, if you decide you have a security incident and you turn out to have a poor patching policy, or you decide to accept the risk, maybe it's also your liability. And this is fairly strong there in terms of penalties and enforcement. We may see either EU policy driving or organic, if you like, change of behavior because of the way the regulation or parts of different regulations will be enforced. But there's definitely room there.
I'm certain both Cisco and Broadcom would love BT to replace their equipment every 5 years, but I'm not sure.
We're critical infrastructure too, right?
Well, at least that is using a better term for some of the critical infrastructure than the Solarium Commission in the United States was using for systemically important critical infrastructure, which, if you're tracking acronym speak, that becomes SICKY. So people have decided that we need to come up with a new acronym for that. We're getting close to the point where I will also open it up to the audience for questions. So please start thinking of your questions so we can address some of the concerns that you have. I think one of the, there's an interesting question here. We haven't talked as much about, for example, like, say, open source software where the community sort of moves on, or like where the original equipment manufacturer is just gone, like they're not there anymore. And so, are there times when we should actually have the government or a nonprofit, group actually take on the burden of supporting some of this technology? Are there circumstances where that would actually be more cost effective than trying to, move to some completely different solution?
I think you've pointed this out, Elias, before. This was tried to a certain extent under the Cyber Resilience Act. So there was a provision in there which talked about making sure essentially that if you reach to the end of the unsupported, that you released the source code so that it could be patched by others, by third parties. In the end, that was watered down to a point at which it essentially says that you should think about doing it, right? I think there's a reason they got to the point where they said you should think about doing it, frankly. Obviously there's the situation that something which was initially crafted as being closed source rather than open source. There's probably some logic in that. You have to think about it from an intellectual property point of view. That might be seen as opening up, code base, which then gets reused in other software and so forth. But I think beyond that, I'm not convinced it gives the right incentive. So, we're talking about what's going to encourage companies to eventually move off the unsupported stuff, giving them a lifeline of saying, oh, don't worry, the open source community or the government is out there supporting it. I think that's, patching over, just putting a plaster over it rather than really solving it. And I think that the incentive also on the side of the open source or certainly on the government would be less than the company which has to keep maintaining its own and has reputational issues and probably has the engineers who wrote the code in the first place, knows it. I'm not convinced it's a strong solution. Not as a general solution, at least.
I also think, just picking on this and sidetracking slightly, Michael, I don't also think that this is the key problem of having unsupported open source packages. There's always a solution for us because we've got access to the source code. We can inspect ourselves. We can use sophisticated DevSecOps tooling and stuff like this to manage it and fix it ourselves. The biggest problem for us is today all of these specialized devices that are essentially black boxes provided by third parties. Don't want to look too close into the room to anybody specific. But essentially going away from this to commodity hardware, software components with specific IP on top will give us much more possibilities of patching it, upgrading the operating system underneath it, as well as having closed boxes that go into a corner of an Exchange building, just get electricity and a fiber cable and then live their life there, doing nothing. So I think the saving grace for us is going to open standards, many more APIs, and replaceable software layers. And so my wish would be for the companies to really focus on the service layer, application layer, if you want, where they have their IP and the differentiator, and then make a agreement on the operating system level, on the commodity hardware, stuff like this, and leave this to somebody else potentially.
So I will open it up at this point to questions from the audience, if there are any, on this particular topic. Don't worry, I've got more questions up here, but it's like, but if there are any in particular.
Hi, moving, I guess, a bit more into the market side of things. Are organizations, are you familiar with organizations providing new types of sort of perpetual licensing agreements that builds in hardware replacement, in order to start to, attach this? I wouldn't want to, propose or advocate for policy to necessarily advocate for this, but whether or not the private sector is approaching it that way, I'd be curious.
So Jamie, yes, there are some areas. So for example, for BT, but I guess for other telcos and similar, we'll do the same. So we have some managed services as well. So we've got agreement in particular with the RAN, so the radio access network. So AK mobile towers, if you want, for example, they are actually provided by a third party or multiple third parties. They are fully serviced. The hardware can get replaced as part of this on a regular basis as well. From a contextual point of view, I feel the margins are a little bit high. So there is no need for policy, let's put it like this. It's rather, yes, we have service agreements that also include hardware. Cisco are offering us to replace our hardware on a regular basis. So we have got discussions around this. So this exists today, and it makes sense. I think, again, for me, the problem there is it gets replaced with another set of specialized hardware and specialized blocks. And this is where we need to approach open RAN, open APIs, and abstraction layers that really focus on the application layer and reduce the rest to commodities.
Yeah, I mean, you took the words out of my mouth when it comes to hardware as a service and what's happening on that side. Actually, interestingly enough, if you look at the NCSC, the advice around this, UK NCSC, not Netherlands, who was in the room earlier, they actually mention when it comes to obsolete devices that it's good for smaller companies to think about moving through to SaaS, right? So I'm talking about the software layer. Just from the sense of it's something which will then be installed, updated, less involvement in the security itself. I think there's space for everything, but I think it's absolutely part of the process to think about it that way. Yeah.
I would agree. So we're making components. So from our perspective, the arguments about Open RAN that you mentioned make a lot of sense. But at the same time, what we see is move more and more of different network infrastructure on the cloud layer. So, but that doesn't mean that the cloud layer should not be patched, updated, kept right version, all the security controls that need to be in place. So the requirement to deal with aging and how you want to manage depreciation from a market standpoint and link to that, the security problems will still be there, even if the security or the technology somehow transitions. The question will be, in a way, how much more control will there be or ease of control will there be at the level of the operator? But again, with control comes the liability, or the responsibility, I should say, for making sure that the different measures are deployed properly, wearing still the lawyer hat.
With great power comes great responsibility, so we can have another movie reference for,
Very good.
Yeah. So are there other questions from the audience? Any other? Oh, yep. Yeah. Over there.
Yeah.
Can't see.
Good afternoon. Radorepa speaking from a Slovakian Prim Rep. I have a question coming back to CRA. I think that is your favorite topic. And within the CRA, there was famous Article 10, Para 5, where in the latest talks, European Parliament pushed the Council back to introduce so-called support periods for products. So I'm interested to know more in your industry perspective, whether you will be able to comply more with the current assessments, or how do you look at it from the general point of view? Thank you.
To be honest, the support period piece, I think the first idea, which was to be transparent about support periods, is a good one.
Yeah.
And I think that made a lot of sense. I think where we've ended in the final text, if I'm being absolutely honest, isn't ideal, because there's quite a lot of discrepancy between the articles and the recitals on how you calculate that. Above and beyond that, there's this requirement which this power given to the commission to adopt additional, impact, what they called IAs, implementing acts, that's the word for it. Additional implementing acts to look at particular product categories and say it's going to be longer, shorter, or the other. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about how that plays out. I am a little bit worried when they start to just up the ante and think, oh, the solution is to keep extending out how long the product support period works for. Because I think there's supporting a product at a level where you really support it. And then I think they're supporting it to tick the box and that you've done the support on that product and kept it up to speed. And I think it's like, if you end up with extraordinarily long support periods, I think you disincentivize the technology refresh, which would actually be better in the end. It's okay. We'll live with it. We'll find our way through, but we're still trying to figure out what it really means.
And can I just add a real world example? Sorry, I'm speaking to the pillar. So we've got, we provide routers and internet access points to our customers, obviously, and they have them at home. Sometimes they put them under the sink and all of those places, and you wonder a little bit how they manage their equipment. Anyways, every 5 years, we send around a new badge and we say that, hey, look at this shiny new box. It's really the best thing you've ever seen. New bells and whistles, capabilities, you can manage your children much more efficiently, stuff like this. So really good stuff. What do you think what they're doing? Well, they keep the old stuff. The new stuff goes on eBay straight away. So there you go. I mean, you can have all the policies and enforcing support and stuff like this. We would love to replace the equipment after 5 years in order to get our estate more secure. Our customers don't play along. So how do we manage this? Are we then getting hit by the stick that you guys want to wield out? Because our customers do not play along. This is a real world problem that we're having. So the solution we do now is actually we're renting out the equipment so we can hit our customers with a stick.
I love the fact that Christian brought up the consumer versus industry problem, because that's such a big discussion point in the context of CRA. The first time that on this panel that distinction crossed my mind was when Michael raised the backwards compatibility problem. Very quickly, a very small story. I used to work for a company called Symantec that used to have a product called Norton. Because we knew that the refresh of the personal PCs was every 3 years, the Ferrari of cybersecurity at that time, when it had to do with antivirus software, was not the enterprise solution, because it was carrying all the legacy, it was the consumer product. The consumer product in terms of speed, performance, the whole lot, the kind of stuff that I would value as a user was, the thing. Why? Because it did not need to carry all the backwards compatibility of supporting all the way to Windows NT, okay? So there is a very real argument about the fact that the CRA not discussing or even mixing consumer versus enterprise markets, lifestyles and life cycles and the like, is actually creating is a missed opportunity, because the requirements there are fundamentally different. A processor on a BMW is going to live for 20 years. Who's running a 20 years PC? Okay, well, cool. Well done, genuinely, So
and it's never been turned off or rebooted.
Exactly, it's never been rebooted. And let me guess, and you're doing a middleware upgrade. The BIOS, you upgrade the BIOS and the firmware every so often. So there is an issue here. And I would also bring up another point from my perspective, and that has to do with the end-of-life economics. So yes, you need to have transparency of the product. You need to have transparency of the life cycle. But sometimes also you enter a market, you estimate that things will happen, and they don't. The product is losing money. What are you going to do? If you do not have the possibility to end of life, if you do not have the possibility to exit, eventually you're actually reducing the ability of manufacturers to bring products because they have to carry the risk.
So we are just about out of time. So I want to thank my fellow panelists up here. I will leave with two thoughts that we didn't quite get to in the discussion, but just to carry out into further iterations. One is, as we are talking about this in end of life and moving on and upgrading stuff, I can hear my grandmother in the back of my head say, well, that's just because the companies want to make more money and they want to force me to spend more money. And so that's a very real issue that we will have to think about from a policy standpoint. And then the second one is that these policies will be different in different places around the world. Yeah. And so end of life in the United States might have a different meaning than end of life here in Europe, which might be different again than Japan or Indonesia or South Africa. And so navigating this for global companies will be an even bigger challenge. But with that, I want to thank my panelists, and I will turn it over to Ari Schwartz for the last thing between us and drinks. So.
Very nice.